We live in an on-tap world. From energy to food to water to dry goods, our lives depend on imports arriving when we need them. But sooner or later, disasters, either natural or of our own making, will inevitably halt the flows that supply entire cities, not just for a few hours, but for days, weeks, months, or even years. Surviving that requires more than just individual prepping. A bug-out bag isn't going to save you for years and years, especially not when millions of your closest neighbors are also facing the same problem. This is why cities need passive resilience, so they don't fall apart when the active systems they depend on break. Unfortunately, most cities are not ready. But not to worry, as a permaculture urbanist, I've got you covered. Today we'll look at the threats that might shut off those flows, and then we'll sketch 5 upgrade paths for passive resilience in cities. Welcome to Edenicity, best practices for sustainably abundant cities. All right, let's have a look at the threats, starting from the most pressing. Now, I've covered dust storms in a prior episode, and they aren't very common events in most places, but when they happen, they can literally take your breath away, causing damage to lungs and machinery, and in the worst cases, burying crops in the fields. Closely related to dust is the smoke from the many wildfires that are breaking out throughout the world. And again, the damage is just one breath away. The next big threat is electromagnetic pulses, such as you get with nuclear attacks, some cyber attacks, and geomagnetic storms. We're actually winding down a major geomagnetic storm season for the Earth. And these happen at periods of high solar activity, where coronal mass ejections can send huge blobs of plasma hurtling into the Earth's magnetosphere, compressing the Earth's magnetic fields, and setting up massive currents along every long piece of metal on Earth, including pipelines and power transmission lines. Now, our power infrastructure does have transformers and other ways to protect itself from these surges, but there are at least a few highly contentious studies that suggest that a really big electromagnetic pulse event could simultaneously blow up a lot of transformers throughout the world, leaving people without power for months or possibly years at a time. The thing that's a little bit worrisome is these really severe geomagnetic storms have been recorded about once a century. There was one in 1921, there was one in 1859, for example, called the Carrington event, that was so powerful that telegraph relays operated without batteries for several hours, using just the auroral currents induced by the bouncing magnetic field of the Earth. Now, needless to say, when electrical power is interrupted, it's bad news through much of the world. We lose our lights, we lose power to things like elevators and refrigerators. In fact, when I was a market gardener, we had a really severe power outage that affected the entire county, and it was weeks before some of my fellow market gardeners got back online. For people who had large freezers full of meat for sale at market, this was an absolute disaster. I've also been in 2 buildings where we lost power in winter, and the pipes froze and burst, and we had floods. So losing electric power is no joke, and cities need to plan for this at the city scale. Next up are floods, quakes, and storms, which cause immediate damage to buildings, of course, but are almost always followed by long-term health consequences. In the case of a flood, waterlogged building materials can take a long time to dry out, during which time they can be overrun with toxic mold. After a quake, water can get into the structure of a building, weakening it, also causing mold, and also possibly becoming a breeding site for mosquitoes that can carry disease. Now, the flip side of floods is drought, which can be very serious because none of us can survive more than a day or two without water. And of course, longer term, there's the threat of famine and fire risk as well. And then finally, I think we all understand this these days, political instability, which can interrupt all of the supply chains that we depend on for survival, including food, dry goods, and maybe even energy. So here's a quick summary of the threats and their harms. And the question is, how can cities build up their passive resilience? Well, they can do it at 3 critical times. First of all, during initial planning. If a city is expanding or growing, it's easiest at that time to create a passive resilience plan for all aspects of the cities, from the utilities to transportation to energy to construction. Second, cities can put in these upgrades during the normal course of maintenance. Everything in a city wears down over time. Streets, buildings need repair and eventually replacement. With a proper passive resilience plan, cities can upgrade their codes so that when infrastructure and buildings are replaced, they increase passive resilience. And then finally, of course, rebuilding after disasters such as the LA fire or major floods, storms, or earthquakes that destroy large swaths of a city. The lesson in all 3 cases is to plan ahead, and cities can do this in 5 areas. And I'll present them here in the sequence that you would consider them in the initial planning phases of a city. First of all is planning for water and fire. The overarching theme is to rehydrate the landscape. According to the channel Water Stories, 87% of the world's wetlands have been drained, and countless additional areas that retained water in soils and living plants have also been dehydrated due to human activity. So everything on this list speaks to the overarching theme of rehydrating the landscape. First of all, we do this by identifying many local water sources and cycles. These can be rainfall, springs, rivers, lakes, seasonal snowmelt, and glacial melt. Next, we use earthworks and tree plantings to slow, spread, and soak rainfall into the soil to buffer floods and droughts and recharge groundwater. This is not a piecemeal project. This needs to be done with intent and intensity throughout the city. And I've spoken about this before on this channel. Now, trees do a wonderful job holding water both in the soil and in their living tissue, but they also have the potential to build up fuels for fires. In this case, the key mitigation is species selection. In almost all environments, there's tree, shrub, and grass species that are fire-resistant and others that are not. The ones that are not fire-resistant are often fire-loving in that their germination condition is the low potassium soils that you find after a fire. And in addition to that, of course, a prudent program of pruning, thinning, and chipping helps to reduce the fuel loads and the possible spread of fires. I also have a note here about catchment, catching water off of roofs and hardscape, such as roadways and walkways. And this water can be stored in cisterns for immediate use, with the overflow, as well as the gray water, that is to say wash water, flowing out to nearby urban forests, which soak it into the soil, recharging groundwater and hence wells and springs. These are techniques that have been known since antiquity all over the world, but which have sadly become less common in the modern world, where we've come to depend on large dams and electric pumps. Anyway, our best defense against both floods and fire is to rehydrate the land. Our next upgrade is energy, which always begins with conservation. Now, at a city scale, we have the opportunity to conserve in areas that individuals simply can't on their own. By building mixed-use, transit-oriented neighborhoods, we can reduce the amount of energy that it takes to get from place to place because people are closer together. And in the case of Edenicity, we make these car-free, which frees up anywhere from 50 to 80% of the space in a city for other uses, such as urban forestry. Also, by focusing on public transit rather than private cars, we can reduce our transportation energy use tenfold, and also the materials used for transportation by factors of 50 or more. So all of this brings down our total consumption of energy and the rate at which we need to draw energy. In addition to that, we can add building energy efficiency standards, and this can be really easy. Just using high-quality insulation and heat pumps goes a really long way. Just these two measures can bring down our energy consumption by 77%. Then on-site renewable energy becomes that much easier to supply. Now, as we did with water, we want to use many different sources of energy at any given site. At the very least, combining wind and solar energy, which are often complementary because cloudy winter days are often pretty terrible for solar power, but quite windy, and adding hydro and geothermal energy sources where it's available. In addition to multiple energy sources, we should have multiple ways of storing energy, whether it be chemical in batteries, thermal, or gravitational. So thermal is where you're just cycling fluids through soils under a building, for example, to heat it in the winter and cool it in the summer. And gravitational storage is just water towers or high dams where the water is pumped uphill when you have an excess of power and then allowed to run downhill through generators when you need it. Producing energy at the small scale on site shortens the transmission antennas during an EMP event and also is much easier to shield. Now, of course, in even a fairly small city, you would want to have, at the very minimum, a microgrid to balance the power and reduce the amount of storage required overall. At the small scale, a microgrid with surge suppression plus automatic isolation, this would be automatic cutoffs, should be sufficient to survive an electromagnetic pulse event. And really critical infrastructure, small-scale data centers, for example, would routinely be put in Faraday cages, which is just a metal mesh sheath that protects them from all pulse events. Okay, now that we've handled flooding and fires and energy, we can really get into the details of building construction. And this always begins with strong seismic design. I've lived through a number of earthquakes, including one that had never had an earthquake in living memory. This was probably triggered by nearby fracking. But even in that area, there's long-term geological evidence of really huge earthquakes that happen every few thousands to few millions of years. So strong seismic design is just basic for passive resilience wherever cities are built. Buildings should also be built with floodable ground floors and basements, including mold-resistant concrete. Now, the problem with concrete is that it's very carbon-intensive in its manufacture. But there are some new materials coming out that are up to 90% less carbon-intensive and that use many industrial wastes in their manufacture. And these would be geopolymers, which are very moisture and mold resistant. Next step, add passive climate control standards, which include insulation, where we have the really promising opportunity to embed insulation in concrete structures. For example, hempcrete uses ground-up fibers to give the concrete tensile strength, as well as insulation properties. We can also build buildings so that they get the right amount of sunlight to warm or not warm the interiors, depending on the climate and season. And in extreme hot climates, we can use the vernacular architecture of those regions, which includes the wind catchers that you see pictured here in this photo from Dubai. Wind catchers are really great. There's many variations. Some run cool air into a big underground thermal mass at night and then catch hot daytime breezes and run it through that same area to cool the air before sending it out into the living areas. Others just take those hot breezes and run them over a moistened mesh for evaporative cooling and humidification to provide indoor comfort. And notice that in both cases, these are passive devices. They don't need a fan or electricity to work at all. So these are really catching on after they were temporarily displaced by air conditioning in the 20th century. Now, some building upgrades can be really simple. For example, just making sure that we use ample natural lighting. If you live in a building, for example, chances are there are no windows in the emergency exits, and there should be. It's a really simple upgrade. Now, depending on climate, you might want to have a tight envelope in your building, meaning that it's sealed against air exchange. But then when you do that, you need to actively bring in and filter outside air through a heat exchanger if necessary. And if you're going to do that, you need local backup power to supply that system, or a hybrid system that uses wind catchers or some similar technology. And over the years, I've seen quite a few passive technologies, including air tubes that ran underground into the house that, combined with a solar chimney, cooled the house during the summer and warmed it in the winter. Now that we have water, energy, and a place to live that is secure, let's look at what it takes to become resilient in food. Now, you might think that we would start with ways to store food for the long haul. This is what a lot of preppers do. But that's difficult. If you add up how much food and how much space you need for even a few months worth of food and water, it's a lot. Now, I realize that we're living in times of great political instability and potentially massive disruption. So I have stocked up a little bit, but I've made another commitment, which is that for the first time in a long time, I've committed to having a little bit more body fat than usual. And that's simply because a pound of fat will keep you alive 80% longer than a pound of muscle in a total famine. I think that really illustrates the futility of individual prepping. But at the city level, there's a lot we can do. First of all, by removing car infrastructure as much as possible and putting in year-round crops. These would be layered plantings, as I've discussed in several other episodes, that include a mix of annuals and perennials. And rather than having a lot of grains in the mix, we would focus on tree crops, as well as tubers, greens, fruits, and nuts. Just to make food accessible for as much of the year as possible, we would plant early and late varieties of everything. And above all, wherever you are, it's worth getting to know and plan for growing indigenous foods. For example, in Southeast Ohio, when I was a market gardener, you couldn't keep certain plants like lamb's quarters, purslane, and chickweed out of your garden at different times of the year. But all of these are really nutritious foods. Lamb's quarters, or Chenopodium berlandieri, was foraged 8,500 years ago in the Ohio River Valley and had been domesticated by 3,700 years ago. It's basically a native quinoa that is perfectly adapted to growing nearly everywhere with essentially no maintenance. I would pick it throughout the summer and boil or steam it just like you would broccoli and have it with nearly everything. Now, once you have those year-round crops established, think about on-site food processing and storage. And in this case, you're looking for crops that produce or store many months and cook quickly, unlike most grains and some beans. For storage, of course, I like sweet potatoes. And when you're harvesting, do be sure to harvest the greens and enjoy those because they are both edible and really nutritious. I'm also a big fan of Tromoncino squash, which is both prolific and I've found keeps at room temperature for at least 9 months. So with a combination of year-round crops in the city and choosing varieties that store easily without refrigeration, cities can dramatically increase their passive resilience. And our final upgrade is in the area of information and communications. Full disclosure, I once worked under NASA grants as an archivist, so I was kind of a specialty librarian. And here's what I found. In my work, in the data center where I worked, there were all kinds of digital data products. These were magnetic tapes mostly, a few other digital products. And we were rapidly losing the ability to read all of them, whether it was through obsolescence or the readers no longer functioning or the actual media, in particular the plastic casings of the magnetic tapes, disintegrating just due to age. What we found was that over time, digital products just simply didn't hold up. Meanwhile, photographic products, maps, anything that was printed on paper held up just fine. When the artist Pablo Picasso was nearing the end of his career, he was considering his legacy. And so he asked himself, what materials would stand the test of time? And he chose two. Porcelain, which can take any weather and lasts thousands of years, and paper, which civilizations figured out how to store, again, for thousands of years. So maintaining libraries is a key step to maintaining the communications and information infrastructure of a city. And the key word here is prioritize. Policymakers need to prioritize libraries and let the librarians set the priorities for their collections. Way back when I ran my software company and I was trying to learn how to code, the library had a far better selection of books than the bookstore. So let the librarians prioritize their collections, and they will make sure that these collections include plenty of printed books, maps, and newspapers. In addition, there's specialized libraries such as tool libraries. I've used those in building tiny houses and found them very helpful. Libraries can also function as emergency shelter. This may seem really surprising, but in Columbus, for several years running, the libraries have kept longer evening hours so that people could come and take shelter from dangerous heat waves. And finally, libraries and other public buildings should maintain large mechanical outdoor clocks. Now, the next tip may seem really mundane, but it's also critical if there are major interruptions to electric power. Regular meetings in towns need to happen on schedule with the capability to keep printed records and to post printed bulletins where people can see them in public places. Voting and ballots can, of course, be done on paper, as they were done through most of my life. But in the long run, as I've discussed in a prior episode, cities might start looking into some more direct forms of democracy, such as dynamic governance, at least at the block and neighborhood level. As more people become involved with one another in solving political problems together, we build up a type of local immunity to large-scale political instability. And also, as I mentioned in that earlier episode, dynamic governance sends delegates both upwards from neighborhoods, for example, to town meetings, and from town meetings down to neighborhoods that together form an unforgeable living proxy, making the process that much harder to corrupt. Okay, here's a summary of the 5 strategies for passive resilience in cities. This is our citywide prepping strategy. To guard against flood and fires, we need to rehydrate landscapes around cities and within cities, and build up many local sources and cycles of water. For energy, we need mixed-use, transit-oriented neighborhoods with on-site energy production and storage. Buildings need durable materials that can handle floods, as well as passive heating, cooling, and lighting. For food, we need to make room for and actually plant layered year-round crops within the city. And then finally, for the flow of information and communications as well as governance, we need libraries with hard copy materials, including books. And cities should build their capacity for direct democracy, whether that be through dynamic governance or any of a number of similar schemes. Thanks as always to the wonderful patrons. You really make this channel possible. If you're new to Edenicity, welcome. And be sure to check out our publications in the links below in the description. And while you're there, if you see that subscribe button, be sure to click that so you don't miss out on more resilience strategies for cities. Take care, stay green, see you next time.